Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I truly hope that you're in very good form tonight. And before we get started, let me just remind those of you who haven't subscribed to the channel to please do so, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's terrifying Bigfoot account. Dear Sarah, my name is Lucas, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2009, around the time of bow hunting season. I do not want to give the details of where the location was, for the specific purposes of keeping all my details strictly private and confidential, if you don't mind. I grew up in the North American wilderness, and my father and grandfather before him were all very keen, astute, and brilliant hunters. My father taught me everything I know today. He gave me wilderness survival skills, fishing, tracking, and hunting abilities. I lived with my parents in a very idyllic wooden cabin, which was quite literally in a very remote area, flanked by vast areas of forest, of mainly pine, spruce, and large oaks, and I knew those woods like the back of my hands. I also knew of areas unexplored by other hunters that were open for the hunting season, but were so well off the beaten track, in uncharted, unexplored territory, which was ideal for my friend and I, who liked to hunt in those remote areas. Besides, there were some hefty specimen of deer around there, who sensibly knew the best places to keep a low profile during the hunting season, and some had lived out to a hefty old age, because they had surreptitiously avoided the hunter's bow. One thing I always did before hunting season was to scout the area where I wanted to hunt, and I did this with my hunting partner Joel, whom I attended middle school with, and we were also firm friends. I enjoyed scouting latent areas for hunting opportunities. I was hankering to get a general perspective on the layout of the land and checking for recent deer scat, trails, tracks, as well as water sources like streams, ponds, and creeks, where the deer invariably congregate to drink. Bear in mind, Joel and I were particular about our hunting preferences, as we wanted to take down some hefty prize specimen of deer with those impressive racks, but this does require discerning areas not commonplace to other hunters to ensure the best opportunities for success. On our third day, I emphatically believed that we had hit the jackpot, and I discovered a remote spot that was secretly tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and judging by the large quantities of fresh deer scat and the distinctive hoof impressions in the ground, we had found a potential gold mine for our hunting. As we ventured deeper into the heart of the woods, things were looking very promising for us indeed. The wind was blowing against our faces with a cool breeze, and the soft shafts of beautiful sunlight bounced through the forest canopy, lighting up the pretty underlying thicket in soft golden hues of pretty shades of contrasting greens. We watched the squirrels darting up trees, looking at us curiously, and we saw numerous songbirds that filled the forests with their joyful chorus, and we encountered hefty specimens of deer that scattered past us very quickly, not looking at all thrilled to see us. After a while, I felt like things had changed in the woods, and we definitely sensed an evil malaise. It was as if the cheerful, happy countenance of the woods had shifted and was suddenly overtaken by a dark, ominous presence that was leaving Joel and I feeling exceedingly uncomfortable. It was like we could sense that something wasn't quite right, but we couldn't put our finger on what that actually was. It was quite extraordinary, because the birdsong had all but dissipated, and everything became eerily quiet and incredibly still. You literally could have heard a pin drop. It was that quiet. Suddenly we smelt this really rank, horrible sulphurous smell that smelt like something was rotting. It was causing my eyes to water and my nose to burn profusely. It was a very disconcerting smell. Joel and I started to investigate where this strange odorous smell was coming from, and then we stumbled across this huge 8-foot-tall structure that was overlaid with layers and layers of heavy pieces of timber that had been entwined with vine leaves, making what appeared to be a wooden hut of some kind. We walked in and around the structure, and one area was completely covered with soft grasses and lots of feathery down from birds, and then there were soft mosses that had also appeared to be on this sleeping area, that had been crushed down by a heavy weight, almost as if something monstrously huge had been lying there. I bent down on my knees to smell the nest and to feel it, and it smelt very punch, and I could tell that it was still warm to the touch, as if something had very recently been lying there. Far too recently for comfort, I have to add. "What the heck is this?" said Joel. I was too stunned to say anything, as I surveyed the whole area very curiously. On one of the corners of the structures were layers upon layers of deerskins, and they hung on top of each other, and then on the walls of the structure were some human clothes. There was a pair of khaki pants, a bright red polo shirt, and a pair of white sneakers on the ground. It gave the distinct impression that a human was living in the structure, because the clothes were in almost perfect, pristine condition, and smelt as if they'd been snatched off the washing line, and the sneakers looked so new, and also as if they'd almost been recently washed. It was all decidedly odd. However, I sensed that the clothes were a decoy of some kind, almost there to give you the false impression that this hut-like structure was inhabited by a human being, when in my opinion something non-human was living in here. But what? I could not imagine. "Do you think someone is living out here?" asked Joel, looking at me in concern and regarding the pristine clothes. "I mean, who would live in the middle of the woods like this?" It did seem decidedly odd. "That's what I think we're supposed to think," I said. "It's a deceptive ruse of some kind, by a very intelligent creature." "Done by whom?" asked Joel. "That's what I want to know," I said. We looked around the wooded clearing to see if we could find any more clues for ourselves, and that was when we discovered a massive pile of animal bones, piled on top of each other in a very neat and tidy heap, and I knew that this had to have been done by something extremely intelligent. "Look at this," said Joel in amazement. We came across a pile of impressive antlers and large piles of stones stacked on top of each other, leaving us with more questions than answers. Who or what was living out here, I wondered. The only intelligent creature capable of doing this was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, I thought. However, it had never crossed my mind or even momentarily occurred to me that these creatures could actually really be real. I truly believe that all the so-called Bigfoot encounters you hear about were a product of misidentification, and that most erroneous sightings had been that of a bear rather than a Sasquatch. Now I was beginning to wonder whether I could be wrong. Suddenly I really began to feel as if we were being watched. I could feel and sense a pair of predatory eyes on me, and I began to feel very unsettled. I could feel my heart pounding and my pulse racing. Suddenly this terrifying feeling of impending doom engulfed my whole being, that gave me the expeditious desire to evacuate this place as quickly as I possibly could, and never ever come back. I could feel, sense, and taste evil, almost as if I'd been fumbling around the devil's lair, and he was about to come out after me with his pitchfork in tow. "Let's get out of here," I said to Joel. "Now!" Joel did not answer me. He stood still, like a motionless statue, seemingly frozen to the spot, and he was pointing towards some saplings in the thick undergrowth that appeared to be swaying menacingly backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And then suddenly, between some of the open spaces in the leaves, I could detect a very large, dark, shadowy form that at first glance looked remarkably like a bear. Suddenly a small sapling was pulled towards one side like a large curtain, and staring at us through the undergrowth was an enormous cone-shaped face that looked remarkably ape-like in appearance, with very deep-set, dark, hostile eyes that were so filled with hateful rage. The creature was straddled on all fours, and then he rose up on 2 feet, towering at an impressive 9 feet. It started pounding its monstrous chest and stamping its enormous muscular legs in an act of incandescent rage. The creature was Herculean in size. He looked like he'd stepped out of a monster movie and taken on physical form. It was without doubt a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, and it was covered with loose, fleecy, dark hair that looked exactly like dreadlocks, and it was very matted and tangled and smelt incredibly rank. Now I knew where the foul smell emanated from. The creature was wearing the smell, and he began to huff and puff and make these dreadful, deep, guttural, irate grunts that sounded distinctly ape-like. He continued to beat and pound his chest in a very dominant stance, and he began to curl back his mouth to reveal a set of pearly, huge, human-like teeth, and then the creature began to roar like a lion. The only problem is a lion's roar would have been intimidated. This would have been far more intimidating than any lion's roar, let me tell you. He proceeded to reach for some hefty tree branches and splintered them in front of us as if to say, "This is what I'm going to do to you." It was like he was taunting, deriding, heckling and teasing us to engender fear in every fibre of our being, and his tactics were working brilliantly. We were so terrified, we barely knew what to do. Never before had I ever felt so feeble and so pathetic in all my life. The capricious Bigfoot reminded me of those out-of-control erratic elephants you get in Africa when they come into musk because of their high levels of testosterone that seemed to drive them to heightened levels of belligerent aggression. He was behaving exactly like this. "Walk slowly," I commanded Joel. "Whatever you do, make sure you do not run. Avoid any eye contact with the creature. Keep looking down and act submissive." Joel and I focused on the ground, avoiding the creature's gaze, and turned around, walking away very, very slowly. The creature continued to roar, and then he started hurling stones at us, provoking us to run, so that he could pursue us and either harm us or kill us. "Keep walking, Joel," I commanded. "Keep walking. Don't run. Don't run. Joel, don't run." It was the most onerous thing that I've ever done, walking away slowly, because believe me, it was so hard. I wanted to run away as fast as I possibly could, almost as much as this creature clearly wanted to tear us apart, limb from limb. But first he wanted to get us to run. I was certain of that. I could feel those cold, dark eyes burning through us, and that hatred was so palpable you could physically feel it. Even as we walked away, we were both physically shaking. "I cannot do this," whispered Joel. "I need to run. I've got to get away from this monster. I can't keep walking like this. I just can't. There's no way. I've got to run." "If you run, you're dead," I said. "He wants you to run because he gets off on it. You will be giving him what he wants. Don't run. Keep walking." We could hear the creature behind us, and he was huffing and puffing and making these terrifying grunts, and his breathing was so heavy you could almost feel it at the back of your neck. Joel just suddenly lost it. He couldn't take it any more. He just had to run from the creature as fast as he could, and I watched him sprinting away, and I groaned. Oh! The creature went dashing after Joel at lightning speed on his long, agile, hairy legs, passing me in the pursuit of his friend. Not even realizing that I was there, he was so intent on getting to Joel. Joel was now living on borrowed time. I knew it, and he must have known it. I had to help him, but I did not have a rifle with me, so I acquired a broken tree limb that was big enough for me to use, and then I started running after the Bigfoot that was pursuing Joel. My heart was pounding in my chest violently, and I was living on adrenaline surging that surged through my body so fast that it intensified my steps to lightning speed. I myself could not believe how fast I was actually running. The Bigfoot grabbed my friend with his powerful arms, straddling him by the throat with one of his hefty elbows. I knew that one click of the neck to the left or one click to the right, and it would be lights out for my friend forever and ever. It would be over for him. The Bigfoot was so focused on pursuing Joel and killing him that he did not realize that I was standing literally a foot behind him. And I dropped my tree limb and picked up a large rock I found on the ground, and I threw it upwards because the Bigfoot was very tall, to the back of his head with brute force, aiming it at the creature. My aim was spot on and incredulous, even if I say so myself. I had hit him in the back of the head incredibly hard, and the huge wacky blow caused the creature's head to wobble precariously. The Bigfoot turned around to look at me through dazed, fuzzy eyes that had almost lost their focus completely. It would seem that he had become disorientated and dizzy, and his anger was temporarily suppressed because he clearly didn't know where he was. He released his grip on Joel, and his eyes rolled in the back of his head, and he looked more and more confused, and he certainly lost his faculties for a moment and could not remember who or where he was. I think the head bang had definitely concussed him. While the Bigfoot was in a mental stupor, a seemingly whirling maze of blurring stars rocketing in his head like a flurry of colourful fireworks, I took my opportunity to get Joel to move. "Run, Joel! Run now!" I shouted to him and took full advantage of the Bigfoot's unstable mental condition, and Joel and I began to run as fast as we possibly could from the creature, and we managed to make it back to my jeep, and we sped away as fast as we could, not daring to look back. But fortunately, I think the Bigfoot was still seeing stars, and so wasn't going to be running after us any time soon. "You just saved my life," gasped Joel in astonishment. "You rarely managed to make him lose his mental coordination. What did you do?" "I threw a heavy rock at his head as hard as I could," I said. "I think we can safely say he's concussed for the moment." "That was quite some hit," said Joel in admiration. "That took some serious balls on your account. Maybe none of this would have had to happen if you hadn't run away like you did." Joel did not answer, but he did look sheepish. I was furious with him for running off like he did, and very upset with him for not listening to me. I really believed if we had walked away quietly, we may have been all right. I decided to call the police, and I told them that there was a dangerous creature in those woods that had attacked us, but I didn't say it had been a Bigfoot. My excuse was I couldn't see it, but it was chasing us. I told them about the strange nest I'd also seen, and the pristine human clothes hanging on some branches. They asked me to describe the clothes to them. They told me that a man had been skinny dipping in the creek recently and had hung his clothes, fitting the exact description of the clothes that we had seen in the Bigfoot hut. While he went for a swim with his wife in the water, it would seem he had mysteriously vanished after he'd climbed out of the water to retrieve his towel. The wife had seen him drying himself with a swimming towel, and then she turned around to continue her swim in the creek for a little while longer, and when she turned around he appeared to be no longer there, and he seemed to have vanished into thin air. She had searched the entire area for him, calling out his name, but was met with a wall of silence. She had described the whole area as very quiet and taking on a menacing atmosphere. All the wife could see was her husband's clothes hanging on the bush and his sneakers lying beside them on the ground, but she could see no sight or sound of her husband anywhere. She forgot about her husband's clothes on the bush when she went around to just call him and to look for him. But after she came back to retrieve the clothes, they had all gone missing. It was all exceedingly odd, although she did say that she had sensed that something very evil was watching her. A single officer came to interview me, along with a man from the army who wanted me to tell them where I'd seen the strange creature, and I saw an army van with men and guns driving to the location. I never heard what happened, but I'm almost certain that the woman's husband was killed by that nasty Bigfoot. And as for why the creature went to get the human clothes after that, I honestly don't know why. I initially thought that those clothes were some kind of a ruse by the animal. I now believe that they might actually be some kind of a trophy that the animal keeps. It was extraordinary that the Bigfoot kept this man's clothes in such pristine, perfect, mint condition in his hut. And that's something hard to understand. When I told my father what had actually happened to us on our scouting trip, he reprimanded me severely for not taking a rifle with me. He also insisted that Joel and I went back to the location, as he was pretty certain that the army would have dealt with that Bigfoot by now, and that even if they hadn't killed him, the creature would be long gone by now. I was certain he was right. My father believed that if you fell off a horse, you simply had to get back on it, regardless how afraid you were. Otherwise, he said, the fear would destroy and incapacitate your life. It took a great deal of persuasion to get Joel to come back with me to the area of our harrowing encounter, but I finally managed to persuade him. He was such an emotional wreck and was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress after our harrowing ordeal, but after a lot of persuasion, he did finally come with me. We saw no sign of the Bigfoot nest or the piles of bones or stones we had discovered. Everything had vanished and appeared to look very normal. I noticed that the pretty birdsong in the valley had returned, and the wood was alive with squirrels and chipmunks who seemed to have moved into the area. So it was with great trepidation that Joel and I went deer hunting there again. And as you can imagine, we managed to take down a couple of prize specimens of deer with the most imposing racks I've ever seen. Joel has now recovered from his ordeal, and so have I. But if we had not gone back to that place of our attack, I doubt we'd ever got over our ordeal. In fact, I doubt that we'd ever have gone bow hunting again. My advice is to always get back on the horse, because you will be glad you did. I just want to say thank you so much for that story, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I remember once having an accident where I fell off a horse, and my riding teacher at the time insisted that I got back on the horse, and it was the best thing I ever did because I wasn't afraid afterwards. But I think if I had not got back on the horse, it could have really affected me quite badly and discouraged me from riding again in the future. So I definitely think overcoming your fear by doing it again or going back to the spot is a very important thing for a person to do. And you certainly had the most horrifying Bigfoot encounter. And as for the clothes hanging up, I liked your idea of that being a ruse. It could have been a ruse. It could have been a way of somebody going into a hut and thinking, oh, this must be somebody living out here in the middle of nowhere, and literally not realizing that it was a Bigfoot den. On the other hand, it could be a trophy. I think a trophy, the Bigfoot thinks, I've killed this man. Here's a trophy. This is the clothes that he was wearing. Why he went back for those clothes, that can only be for a trophy, I think. But how did he know it was the man's clothes in the first place? That is pretty extraordinary. So I think we've got a very intelligent Bigfoot here. Until next time, goodbye and good night.